Hi guys, today we're going to talk about cell-to-cell communication. This is the beginning of Unit 3, so what makes this unit kind of different is it's shorter than the past two units that we've done. But most of this is going to be new to you. It's probably not material that you've learned in your biology honors course or in Project Lead the Way for the most part. There may be a few things that you recognize. So, today we're just going to go over the different kinds of cell-to-cell communication. This is kind of our overview today. And then, we'll get into the details as we go throughout this week and next week. All right, so the cell-to-cell communication is the mechanisms by which cells receive, process, and respond to chemical signals sent from other cells. Okay, understand that communication in general is a big topic in AP Bio. We want to know how organisms communicate. How do members of the same population communicate with each other? Okay, here we're taking it down to the cellular level. So we're talking about how different cells in your body communicate with each other and why they would need to do that. Also, we're going to talk about unicellular organisms that are only made up of one cell, and how they communicate with each other. And then what I hope you'll get out of this unit is how important this is. Even though it's a unit that you probably have never learned about before, how important it is to the healthcare field, to what we're battling right now with COVID-19. If we want to discover cures for cancer and viable treatments for cancer, it all comes down to cell-to-cell communication. So I hope as we go through the unit, you'll see just how important this topic is. Okay, so you're filling this in on your long sheet, your 11 by 17 sheet. You have two main types of signaling. You have local and long distance. So you might ask your parents about this. Back in the day, even in the age of cell phones, well, maybe it was landlines too, but if you wanted to make a phone call and you wanted to call somebody long distance, okay, usually you waited till after 8 p.m. because it was cheaper. Okay, that was a thing at one time. Now we just call anybody on our phone. It really doesn't matter who. But back then, you used to have a local phone bill and a long distance phone bill. So those are our two main types of signaling, local and long distance. All right, so under local signaling, our first one is called autocrine signaling. Okay, so we always want to utilize our prefixes when we can. That prefix auto means self. Okay, so if we look at our picture here, this is a cell. It is releasing some kind of signaling molecule, but that signaling molecule is going to come back and bind to its own cell, which I know seems kind of weird, like maybe even a little pointless, but this does happen in our body. So this is an important type of signaling. So this is when signaling molecules are released from a given cell and then act on the same cell that released them. Just like you see in this picture. And so if I ever go too fast in these notes, please feel free to pause me and then just pick up when you're done writing. A real life example of this. Many tumor cells will reproduce uncontrollably. I mean, that's what cancer is. Cancer is cells that are abnormal and they have divided too much, okay? One of the reasons that they do that is because cancer cells will tend to release these chemicals that can bind to receptors on their same cell and trigger them to divide again. And so you can imagine if this kept happening over and over and over again, this would cause a proliferation of cancer cells. You would all of a sudden have all these cells in a given area that weren't supposed to be there. Okay, so I'm waiting for them to finish the bus announcement. Sorry, I'm recording this after school. There we go. So just so you see this, this is a cell that is releasing a signaling molecule that is coming back and binding to its own cell. And in the case of cancer cells, it's causing those cells to divide even more. All right, next is juxtacrine signaling. So juxtacrine signaling, think like jux next door, just next door, right? Juxtacrine. This involves direct contact between the cells. They are touching. So there's two types of this. All right. The two types that we're going to learn about are intercellular junctions. So this is where our prefixes come in handy. You might know that the prefix inter means between. If I can get my pen to write here. So signaling between two cells that have some sort of junction. Well, remember in the last unit, we learned about these different kinds of junctions, okay? So you might remember what some of those are. Remember the junctions that connect adjacent plant cells, those are called plasmodesmata. They're kind of like a channel or a tube. And then the channels that connect adjacent animal cells are called gap junctions. Okay, so then underneath that, we're just seeing why this is an example of juxtacrine signaling, specifically intercellular junctions. Basically, you have signaling molecules. You don't just have to have them outside of the cell. They can be inside the cell. They can be in the cytoplasm. And so by having these channels that connect the adjacent plant or animal cells, those signaling molecules in the cytosol or in the cytoplasm, these plasmodesmata and gap junctions allow those signaling molecules to pass freely from one cell to another. Okay, so next, let's look at intercellular, cell-to-cell recognition. So this involves two cells that are normally not connected together to temporarily bind to each other. So it's not like the one before it where those cells were naturally found next to each other. They just had gap junctions or plasmodesmata between them. That's not what this is. This usually has to do with some of our immune cells. This usually has to do with our immune cells that are looking to bind a certain antigen that might be getting displayed on the surface of an immune cell. So let's take a look at that. So this is important in the immune response. So one of the things you're going to see in your Bozeman science video is that, when you have something like a macrophage, which means large eater, and it takes in and chops up something foreign that isn't supposed to be in your body, a lot of times it will display a piece of that something on its surface, okay? And then a certain type of immune cell is like looking for that same antigen. And so when they find each other, they bind. It would be like if a criminal was hiding in your house and you put a picture of him in your window for the police to say, hey, he's here. And then the police came and said, oh, I've been looking for that criminal. And then they bond, okay? So this one maybe chopped up that antigen and displayed it on the surface. This is an immune cell that was looking for that antigen, and they find each other because those pieces are complementary to each other and they fit together, and that's just going to perpetuate the immune response. So what we've talked about so far is autocrine signaling, where a cell sends signaling molecules out that bind to receptors on its own cell. And then we talked about two types of juxtacrine signaling. Those are intercellular junctions, like plasmodesmata and gap junctions, and cell-to-cell recognition, which involves immune system cells, like T cells and B cells and things. Remember that juxtacrine signaling is signaling between cells that are touching. All right, next. Next, we've got signaling that involves a short distance between cells. So remember, that's different from juxtacrine. Juxtacrine, the cells were actually touching. These cells are not, but they are separated by just a really short distance. So there are two types of signaling that involve a short distance between cells. And those are paracrine signaling and synaptic signaling. So that prefix para usually means around or surrounding. And then synaptic, so this is something you may have heard of before. You may have learned about a synapse, which is a connection between two neurons, or maybe something called a neuromuscular junction, which is where a muscle cell meets up with a neuron. So you may have heard of something involving synaptic signaling before. Paracrine signaling is probably new for you. So remember, what binds these two together is that there is a short distance between the cells that are communicating, but they are not touching. Okay, so we're going to take a look at paracrine signaling first. So what's pretty common with paracrine is that you're going to have a cell that secretes some kind of substance into the extracellular fluid, which is just the fluid that surrounds the cell, and that those chemicals are going to bind to receptors on nearby cells. Okay, so what you're going to have, let's see if I can draw you a picture. You're going to have the cell that is going to be releasing these signaling molecules outside of its cell. And then you're going to have nearby cells that have receptors to bind that substance. Okay, and so that substance is going to bind to its receptors and then trigger something to happen in the cell that it bound to. So this may involve something called a local regulator. Growth factor is one of these things that is controlled through paracrine signaling. So growth factor can be secreted by one cell and it can stimulate other cells nearby to grow and divide. So it's kind of like autocrine signaling, except autocrine, whatever signal that it released, bound to its own cell. This is releasing growth factor, but it can bind to a cell that is nearby, that has a short distance. Notice in this picture, a very short distance between the cell that's releasing the chemical and the cell that has the receptor for it. All right, next we're going to look at synaptic signaling, and we'll be going more into this probably next Tuesday and Wednesday maybe. So remember what ties paracrine and synaptic together. They both involve cells with a very short distance between them. But synaptic signaling is its own category because it requires a space between a neuron and another neuron, or it could be a neuron and a muscle cell. And that space is called the synaptic cleft. So the synaptic cleft, a cleft is like a gap, okay? Like someone has a cleft palate. It means that their palatine bones, which form the roof of their mouth, did not fuse completely during development, so there's a space or a gap between them. So think of a cleft like a gap. So a synaptic cleft is a space between two neurons or between a neuron and a muscle cell. So this might be something that you've learned about before. Nerve transmission is one of those few things in this unit that most people have learned something about. So we'll talk about this more next week, but the impulse arrives at the end of an axon, which is called the axon terminal. And when that impulse gets there, understand that it is a change in electricity of that neuron. And so that change in electrical potential there is going to trigger the release of these signaling molecules called neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters get released from one neuron and can bind to a receptor that's located on the next neuron. Or it could be on the muscle cell, but really it's going to be a neuron or a muscle cell that is the receiving cell. Okay, so synaptic signaling has to involve a synapse. So this whole area where two neurons meet up, that's called a synapse. And the space between those two neurons is a synaptic cleft. So the big question happens. Miss Allgood, how do I study for this? How do I study? Well, remember what I told you on the first day of class. You either do this on paper or do this on a dry erase board, but close your notebook and see if you can remember how we organize these notes today. So cell-to-cell communication, local and long distance signaling. And then you're going to try and remember the different categories of local signaling: autocrine, juxtacrine. Okay, but then I have the signaling that involves a short distance between two cells, which would be paracrine and synaptic. Okay, well, I know one of the types of juxtacrine involves cell-to-cell recognition, like those immune cells binding, but maybe I can't remember the other one. Do this as much as you can, adding specific examples in, maybe even drawing a picture in there, until you can do this without looking at your notes. That's how you study. That's how you should be studying for this class every night. You should be going over the new material that you learned that day and mapping it out and making new connections in your brain so that you can remember this better. All right, I think this is on the back side of your long sheet. This is long distance signaling. So sometimes this can be called endocrine signaling because usually the signaling molecules are going to be hormones, and your endocrine system involves glands and the hormones that those glands secrete. Now, one of the defining characteristics of long distance signaling is that those signaling molecules or those hormones get released into the bloodstream. Okay, that is like your interstate highway that allows things to be transported to other parts of your body. So long distance, we are sending those hormones and those signaling molecules to other parts of our body where they're going to act on their target cell or organ. So an endocrine gland secretes a hormone into the bloodstream. Secreting that signaling molecule into the bloodstream is what separates long distance signaling from any of the types of local signaling. So the hormone binds to receptors on the target cell and causes a cellular response by that target cell. In other words, every cell in your body is not going to have a receptor for that hormone. Only the target cells will. It's not like every cell in your body is going to have a receptor for testosterone. Only certain cells will. So they're the only cells that will be able to act on that chemical signal. An example would be insulin. Okay, insulin is secreted by the pancreatic beta cells. So that's the secreting cell. It secretes that insulin into the bloodstream. And then insulin is going to travel through the bloodstream. And most of the cells on your body have receptors for insulin. Because what insulin does is it binds to receptors and it helps to open up glucose channels. So think of insulin like me putting my key in my classroom door, okay? And I might be opening the door so that you guys can all come in. You guys would be the glucose, but I'd be the insulin because my key would be the insulin because my key has to be there in order to open the door to allow you guys, which is glucose, to go into the cells, which would be my classroom. So this is a good example of long distance signaling because while insulin is made in your pancreas, it acts on pretty much every cell in the rest of your body. Okay. This was an activity that I usually do when we're in class together. And I usually have my students come up with little analogies to help them remember the differences. So I'll make my font smaller, but if this might help you to remember this, so we can go through some of these together. Autocrine signaling is like, I'm going to get rid of the like a. So autocrine signaling is like writing a note on your hand to remind you to do something later. So you don't have this sheet, that's okay. I'm just trying to get you to remember things. Or autocrine signaling is like setting a reminder in your phone or setting an alarm on your phone because you're the one that is sending that message or setting that reminder in your phone, but then you're also the person who's going to receive that reminder or see that note on your hand, okay? So when I ask my students to do these analogies, I'm pretty specific. I don't want you to just make up a fluff because I want you to actually demonstrate that you know what that autocrine signaling is. Paracrine signaling might be like, I'm not going to type all these in. Paracrine signaling might be like passing a note to somebody who sits behind you. I don't think kids really pass notes very much anymore. But, you know, paracrine, nearby, okay? Not touching, but close. So maybe somebody that sits behind you in class. Juxtacrine signaling, the best analogy I've heard for juxtacrine signaling would be juxtacrine signaling is like giving somebody a high five. Because in the moment of that high five, your hands are touching and you are passing a message on to that other person like, hey, you did a good job. So it's juxtacrine signaling would be like giving somebody a high five because your hands are touching and one person is sending a message and one person is receiving a message. And then endocrine or long distance signaling, you know, that might be like writing a letter maybe and sending a letter through snail mail. I can't remember really good examples for endocrine or long distance, but maybe you can come up with one. So I just tacked that on to the end because I know everybody learns different ways. So if that helps you to understand this better, then more power to you. All right, make sure you watch the Bozeman Science video and answer your questions on your Google Doc. Bye.